Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Peace Island Institute's Women and Interreligious Dialogue. I hope all of you are doing well and staying safe. To give a brief introduction about myself, I'm Sorga and from Kyrgyzstan. So currently I'm studying computer science at college in Bunker Hill. And so today we have our dialogue and women and interreligious dialogue. So before we get started, I would like to introduce on the Peace Islands Institute Boston. So it is a nonprofit devoted to promoting interfaith and intercultural dialogue. We're welcoming everyone in a society with practical programs to connect people in real life. Our goal is to build loyal relationships, to collaborate on substantial service projects that contribute to society's benefit, and promote universal principles to contribute to a greater understanding and peace. We passionately believe in the power of dialogue and change attitudes. So, firstly, I would like to introduce our moderator of this event. Her name is Dr. Sami Hattapple, and she received her PhD from Arizona State University in Religious Studies in 2012. She holds an master's degree in Gender Studies and Religion from SOAS University of London in UK. She specializes in the question subjectivity, self-construction, and women's agency in contemporary Muslim societies, particularly Turkey and the Middle East. Her current research examines women and piety in Islam, focusing on cases of deveiling in Turkey. She teaches courses on Introduction to Islam, Women and Gender in Islam, and Islam and Secularism. Thank you. Now we would like to give a turn to Dr. Sami Hattapple.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Sarah, and thank you for the introduction. I also need to, I guess, say that I teach at William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, at the moment, and it's my absolute pleasure to be moderating this session with Professor Catherine Cornille, and she is going to be talking about women in interreligious dialogue, and we could not really find any better person to speak about interreligious dialogue because of all the um, the works that she has produced, especially about how to do the interreligious dialogue. And so we will be listening to Dr. Catherine Cornille, and I will be briefly introducing her before I let the floor for her. But I wanted to kind of praise the book, the Women in Interreligious Dialogue, for the kind of case studies that it brings to the fore and show us a dimension of the dialogue beyond the formal encounters where we usually tend to see male faces. And Dr. Cornell will give us the life of interreligious dialogue in the hands of women, and how can they, if they can bring distinct contributions to that. And Catherine Cornell is a professor of comparative theology at Boston College, where she holds the Newton College Alumnae Chair of Western Culture. Her areas of research focus on theology of religions, comparative theology, interreligious dialogue, and religious hybridity. She is the author of The Impossibility of Interreligious Dialogue and Meaning and Method in Comparative Theology. Her edited volumes include Many Mentions, Multiple Religious Belonging and Christian Identity, Interreligious Hermeneutics, Women and Interreligious Dialogue, the Wiley-Blackwell Companion to Interreligious Dialogue, and Atonement and Comparative Theology. She is the founding and managing editor of the book series Christian Commentaries on Non-Christian Sacred Texts. So it's my pleasure to leave the ground to you, Professor Cornille, with your talk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Topal, for this kind introduction. And I'm happy to be with you this evening and talk about a topic that is really very dear to me. Early on in my career, one of my first publications was this book, which was in Dutch, and the title is Women in World Religions. And then, as Semiha pointed out, since then, my publications have been mostly in the area of interreligious dialogue more broadly, speaking on or on various topics in interreligious dialogue, but the topic of the contribution of women to interreligious dialogue is something that I'm still very passionate about. So my plan today is not so much to talk about this book that was mentioned, Women in Interreligious Dialogue, but just to refer to it as I go over a number of topics that I want to introduce maybe more broadly, and then go into some of the articles when they relate to these particular topics. So the two questions that I have to discuss this evening is, what might dialogue contribute to the experience of women in their respective traditions? So what can dialogue offer women? And secondly, what can women offer dialogue? What is there a distinctive contribution of women to interreligious dialogue? And if so, what might it be? So those are the two questions I want to reflect on with you this evening. And as Semiha already pointed out, dialogue itself is something where usually what we see are male representatives of different religious traditions who come together either for photo op, where we see them all, representing their religions and getting along with one another as sort of an example for the rest of us, or else typically male representatives of their theological traditions coming together to discuss or dialogue about particular topics. Often, or sometimes, those topics relate also to the experience and in particular to women's issues. And often what we see are male representatives of different religions who discuss women's issues. What then can dialogue contribute to the experience of women in their respective tradition? This is something that has certainly evolved in the past 20 years, the participation of women in interreligious dialogue, even though the dominant representation is still of males. Women are becoming more and more involved also in interreligious dialogue. Often women come together among themselves to discuss topics that are relevant for themselves, but also women participate more broadly in general dialogues between religions. So, first of all, what can dialogue offer to women? I think dialogue offers the possibility for women in different religions to reflect critically on their respective traditions and to contribute constructively also to their religions. So two movements of critical reflection and constructive reflection on their respective traditions. So the contribution of women to interreligious dialogue is a way for women to come together to resist the dominant patriarchy that is still alive in most religious traditions and that has, to be honest, shaped the identity of most religious traditions. If we look at the history, especially of the scriptural religions, so Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Shinto, all of these religions have developed a patriarchal structure that has, for the most part, left women out of positions of authority and leadership and power within the respective traditions. So this is in many ways remarkable because when we look at the foundational texts or scriptures of the different religions, we often see that those texts themselves have a very open, inclusive, often liberative message for women. But what we see is that in the course of history, the way in which the religions develop their authority structures, their hierarchies, tend to exclude women. And what we see is that there really is, in spite of all the differences between religious traditions, there is a kind of similar dynamic that is taking place in different religious traditions, where the authority or the leaders in the respective traditions, who are typically male, have the authority to decide which texts to select and have the authority to interpret the texts. So typically in most of the religions that I have mentioned, women in the course of history have been completely dependent on male authority figures for the understanding and the interpretation of text, and for the choice of which text might be regarded as important or valuable in particular circumstances and in the history of the tradition. So, as we all know, religious traditions and sacred texts are multivalent, meaning that they tend to be very rich in meaning and content. And so how we understand a religion depends to a large extent on which text, which verses are selected, how they are interpreted. And so the exclusion of women in the history of religion from having a voice in the selection and interpretation of texts is a kind of constant that we see in different religious traditions. Another constant that we see is that in the course of history, one of the elements that comes to the fore is a kind of fear of women's sexuality. This is a constant that we see in most religious traditions that I have mentioned, where women's sexuality is seen as a threat to order and to the continuity of the tradition, and so has to be kept under control. So most religious traditions will talk about women as being unreliable, fickle, having to be controlled in one way or the other. And that this fear of women's sexuality manifests itself in different ways in different religious traditions, where women come to be regarded as ultimately responsible for the chastity of men, also not only for their own chastity, but also for the chastity of men in their respective traditions. So the two things, I think, go together to some extent. The fear of women's sexuality goes together partly with the claim to authority and the claim to the power to interpret text and therefore keep women in a subjugated position within the different religious traditions. So these are very general sort of patterns of patriarchy that we see in different religious traditions. An exception to this in most religious traditions is the recognition ultimately of the spiritual authority of women who have renounced the world and are recognized as being spiritually, very elevated and can be seen as sort of teachers, not only for women, but also for men. And I'm thinking of mystics, whether in Christianity or in Islam, or gurus, female gurus in the Hindu tradition, or female nuns in the Buddhist tradition. So in the area of mysticism and spirituality, most religious traditions have recognized sort of the possibility of women to be close to whatever they define as the ultimate reality. And that's not surprising, of course, because in that case, it's not so much the delegation of authority by male figures of authority, but by women's own experience and closeness to ultimate reality that is the basis of their authority. So these are dynamics that we see playing themselves out in most religious traditions, and that's the first area, I think, in which women can help each other understand how these dynamics work. Now, most of those you who are involved in the study of feminism or in the study of religious traditions this will not be a surprise to you, but for believers who are embedded in a particular religion and who don't know anything other than what they have experienced, they may not have the kind of critical distance to reflect on these dynamics. And so the dialogue between religions helps various religious traditions, or women in various religious traditions, to understand these dynamics and to reflect critically on the way in which these dynamics play themselves out in their own religious traditions. So again, the way in which this plays out is very different from one religious tradition to the other, but the dynamics are very similar. And so dialogue between religions can help women in the different religions to understand this. And so some of the first important books in feminist critique of different religions brought together women from Christianity and Judaism, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam to reflect together indeed on this dynamic. And one of them is a famous book by Judith Plasko and Carol Christ called Women's Spirit Rising. And this is kind of a critical reflection on the way in which, mostly in Judaism and Christianity, the way in which God talk, or the talk of the divine, has usually been expressed or God has been usually referred to in male pronouns, and therefore that has affected the understanding of men and women in Judaism and Islam. There have also been, collected volumes of how to overcome patriarchy, religious patriarchy in different religious traditions. So it's an area in which women have really helped each other to understand the dynamics of exclusion and to inspire each other to reflect on their own religious traditions. So they have helped to develop, what I would call a kind of feminist exegesis, or a feminist reading of their respective texts. Not necessarily that the reading has to be the same, but at least there's a kind of reading that looks critically at the respective religious texts and how to interpret them. Beyond this critical reading, feminists have also helped each other to think creatively about how to move forward, not just in terms of critiquing the past, but moving forward with women contributing their own voice to the discourse, developing their own understanding of what is possible in their own respective traditions. So I think both in terms of the critique and also the inspiration to contribute positively to their respective traditions, women have really helped each other across religious traditions to move forward. Now, what are the dangers, though, of this approach of women of different religious traditions helping each other to understand their respective traditions critically? One important danger that also comes up in various of the texts, various of the articles in this volume, is that sort of liberal Western feminists impose their understanding of feminism on other religious traditions. Instead of listening to what women in those religious traditions have to say about their own experience and being open to hearing their voice, liberal feminists from the West have often been accused of just imposing their categories and their critique on other religious traditions. And that, in combination then with the kind of colonial exploitation and accusation of other cultures and religions, has led to, Western feminism often seen or often been regarded as sort of a way of liberating brown women from brown men, as it's sometimes expressed, sort of, and justifying the colonization of those countries for the liberation of women. Right? So the whole idea of feminism and liberal feminism has sometimes been used in those terms, and that's of course something that's problematic and that has been critically studied in several volumes, several articles in this volume. Another danger of this approach of dialogue and women coming together to dialogue is that women might come to accuse other religions of the problems of their own tradition. So very often in the Christian tradition, feminists who look at sort of early Christianity will sort of lift up the message of Jesus as a liberative message over against and as a critique of sort of the subjugation of women in the Jewish tradition before the coming of Christianity. So there's sometimes, a tendency among feminists to, when they look at the original sources of their tradition, to look at their tradition as liberative over against the tradition that went before them as oppressive towards women. So in the relationship between Christianity and Judaism, it has to do with menstruation taboos that were lifted up in Christianity. It has to do with, conceptions of marriage and fidelity that were oppressive for women in the Jewish tradition, and Jesus breaking through those and so forth. So there are all kinds of ways in which the way in which feminism looks at its own early tradition is at the expense of the other tradition. And in this volume, Aisha Hidayatullah talks also about, and this is one of the articles that I suggested you look at in preparation for this evening. She looks at the way in which also some of the early Islamic feminists have come to sort of denounce Christianity and Judaism as being the cause for the way in which the creation story in the Quran has come to be filled out with all kinds of negative prejudices against women. So their point is, or their argument is, that in the Quran there is no prejudice against women in the creation story, and any prejudice is sort of a later absorption within the hadith of Christian and Jewish elements, or mostly Christian elements, that then led to a negative image of women. And so she analyzes that, and then very bravely, I think, for a young Muslim scholar, says, well, we have to take responsibility for the fact that this did catch on also in the Islamic tradition, and that that the Quran isn't sort of completely free of any sort of judgment or hierarchy between men and women and so forth. And if we notice that, then we have to take responsibility for that ourselves, she says, as a Muslim woman, and try to correct ourselves instead of just blaming Christianity and Judaism for the fact that these elements have also come into Islam. The idea that of Eve being the cause of evil and being second in the order of creation and created out of a rib of Adam, all of these elements that are not in the Quran, but that still became also part of the Hadith tradition. So that's another danger, I would say, in sort of feminist critique and mutual critique, that this sort of comes to the fore instead of looking at our own traditions and how that has come to develop. So those are some comments on what women can learn from interreligious dialogue. So they can learn to look critically at their own tradition. They can learn how to find new inspiring sources in their own tradition, and how to move the tradition forward in a constructive way. So the second question is then, what might women contribute to interreligious dialogue? Do they have anything distinctive to contribute to interreligious dialogue? This is an interesting question. I did not have you read the article in the volume that discusses this in particular, but the very last article by a famous Buddhist feminist, Rita Gross, discusses this question in particular. And interestingly, she says that women have nothing distinctive to offer interreligious dialogue. Very provocative, of course. They have nothing distinctive to offer interreligious dialogue, but they have to be at the dialogue table. And for those of you who know something about Buddhism, this position is, of course, also comes out of a kind of Buddhist rejection of an essential contribution of women versus an essential contribution of men. The idea of essences and is something that's not quite, that doesn't rhyme with Buddhist philosophy. So to some extent, it comes out of that kind of Buddhist rejection of sort of essential self. But it's certainly a provocative position, and one that I appreciate insofar as I think women should be free to contribute whatever they might want to contribute to the dialogue. And there shouldn't be sort of a set approach to women's contribution to dialogue. I know that, in my own work in interreligious dialogue, I'm often accused by other women of being too rational and too systematic in my approach and too heady, which is not supposed to be what women's contribution is to dialogue. So I'm sympathetic to not essentializing what women have to contribute to dialogue. And I feel like women should contribute whatever they feel like they want to contribute. But on the other hand, there's something I cannot ignore, and that's the fact that this volume came out of a conference, and it was the last in a series of 5 conferences where we discussed different topics in interreligious dialogue. The first was on criteria of discernment in interreligious dialogue, then interreligious hermeneutics, then economic development and interreligious dialogue, and then cultural change and interreligious dialogue. And for each of these topics, I had invited representatives from a whole bunch of religions to discuss these topics. And then the final one was on women and interreligious dialogue. And it was just unmistakable, the different tone of the last dialogue. So the other dialogues had some women also contributing to it, but for the most part, the participants were male, and very often the discussion was very sort of contentious. I mean, not in a bad way, but arguing against one another and so on. In this conference, it was just remarkable how the women sort of tried to build on what they had heard before and added something new often to what they had heard before. But there was sort of an attempt to build on one another instead of to argue against one another. And I'm not going to say that that's a typical women's way of dialoguing, but it was a difference that was unmistakable, and that has to be mentioned. So feminists have often said that women are more capable of empathy, and so Maura O'Neill is a Christian thinker who has done quite a bit of work in interreligious dialogue, and so her argument is that women have greater empathy, greater capability of assessing emotions in others, and of finding practical solutions. So for her, those are the 3 ways in which women have a distinctive voice or can contribute in a distinctive way to dialogue. They can read emotions more easily, they're more empathic, and they tend to think in terms of practical solutions instead of theoretical, conflicts. Another point that is made also in this volume by Michelle Voss-Roberts is that what women can bring to the dialogue is an expansion of the dialogue beyond doctrine and ethics to also include art, or forms of artistic expression as a way of dialoguing with one another and learning from one another. So dialogue is indeed, I always say, not just a matter of exchanging information, but also learning something new from one another and growing in one's own, religious identity. So for her, the orientation towards more artistic resonance with the other is an area in which women can make a distinctive contribution also to interreligious dialogue. Also in the volume is an article by Mara Brecht, and some of you may have read that article that talks about epistemology and embodiment as a typical women's way of engaging in interreligious dialogue. And that's an interesting point. So that she makes, so because women tend not to be the official representatives of a religion in dialogue, they don't feel like they have to represent the doctrine of a tradition or the whole tradition. And they can turn more to their own religious narration, or not so much, this is the truth, but this is how I have come to the truth, or this is how I experience my religious tradition. So what she calls a more narrative approach to religious sharing. So not just saying what your religion believes, but what it means to you and how you have grown in understanding what it means. So this kind of narrative approach she sees as something that might be a distinctive contribution of women to dialogue based on her experience of studying a dialogue group in Philadelphia for an extended amount of time.
I think at this point, maybe I might join and take it to the Q&A part, maybe, because we are kind of at 7:02 right now. And I actually have a question right about this. In your book about the difficulties of interreligious dialogue, you talk about 5 principles, right? And humility, commitment, interconnection, empathy, and hospitality. And there is this tendency to essentialize women in order to make them to be more involved in dialogue, to emphasize, just like you said, that they are more capable of making connections and maybe revealing their vulnerabilities, sharing their vulnerabilities, creating, having more personal connection. What would be your take on that? Like, on these principles, would women have a different role or a contribution from your perspective?
Yeah, I actually published an article a while ago on that, sort of where the women have a distinct input in terms of humility and commitment, interconnection, empathy, and hospitality. And I do think that for many of these conditions for dialogue, women have a sort of maybe a privileged relation to those conditions for dialogue. Just, take the question of humility. The humility is about, recognizing that your own religion doesn't necessarily have the fullness of truth, and that you're growing in the truth. I think that this is an attitude that women within their own religions often have towards their own religious traditions, partly because they have experienced also their own exclusion. So they know that their own tradition may not have the fullness of truth, that there's still ways to grow in understanding the fullness of truth of their tradition. So I think in different ways, I mean, in terms of commitment, I don't think that there's a necessary difference. In terms of interconnection, though, I do think that there's a level at which women understand each other and connect with each other, maybe aside from their own religious difference, and that allows them to sort of establish sort of a basis for dialogue about other elements. Whether or not women are more empathic than men, then I think the jury is out on that. In the studies of empathy, actually, they argue that the only difference between women and men is that men tend to be more aggressive, and aggression is a problem for empathy. So, but other than that, there's no necessary basis for women being more empathic. And I think in terms of hospitality, there's also, an experience, a possible experience of openness to learning from other religious traditions. So not that women have necessarily, something unique to offer to each of these, or that they are the only ones who can address these conditions for dialogue, but maybe they have a unique voice in each of these conditions, and maybe a facility with the conditions also that comes from their position in their respective traditions.
Mm-hmm. I do have some questions here that I might ask some of them. The last one I'll start with. Where do atheists take place in this interfaith dialogue? Or would we consider maybe women's intercultural, interreligious dialogue more inclusive, or is there any room for non-believers in interreligious dialogue?
Well, I mean, I think there is a place for dialogue with non-believers, but I wouldn't call that interreligious dialogue then. So I think for interreligious dialogue to take place, there has to be a religion that dialogues with another religion, or a representative of a religion that dialogues with another religion. I think there's a whole lot we can learn from atheists also, but that's sort of a dialogue between religion and secularism, or religion and atheism, rather than interreligious dialogue in a strict sense of the term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is this question about the different versions of Abraham regarding Sarah and Hagar, and in the Islamic tradition, it's Sarah is jealous, so she wants them to be banished. Like in that sense, like I also find this interesting. Like Muslim tradition finds no problem in considering Sarah as this jealous woman who kind of becomes this tool of bad action or evil. All the other prophets would definitely be absolved of any kind of sin, but with a woman like Sarah, it's completely okay. Is there any other way of reading this in a different way? Like it was not because of jealousy. Like why did Abraham leave Hagar and his son Ishmael in the middle of nowhere in Mecca? That's actually a question from the audience, and I'm also curious about that.
Is there another way of reading Sarah's responsibility, or so that's one question. Another question is, are Christians and Jews enough aware of Hagar and that part of the story also? Because we always talk about the Abrahamic traditions as if it's an uncomplicated or unproblematic narrative. I think, again, from as a Christian, I think it's difficult for me to say how a Muslim should see Sarah, because we don't tend to see that negative side of Sarah's jealousy. I mean, now it's a way that we have come to see this as problematic, mostly through the dialogue with Islam, and through an awareness of how problematic our understanding of the relationship between Sarah and Hagar is. We just sort of took it for granted, whereas, I think for us it's a matter of redeeming ourselves for ignoring sort of the way we have traditionally understood it. But I mean, from the Muslim perspective, I think it's for Muslim scholars to try to see Sarah in a different light. It would be, again, sort of an imposition to do this from a Christian perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is also related to like women in dialogue. Usually these issues of the particularities of the religion, it's the spirituality is easy to build a dialogue on. Universalism allows it, yet women also come from these religious traditions and are believing in these particular stories. So how they can do this differently than men do in dealing with these concreteness issues, like where they are really cannot ignore the conflicts? How would women do it differently?
Well, I mean, again, it's hard to say in general, but I do think that the kind of the more narrative approach that Mara Brecht talks about is a way to address these conflicting beliefs in a non-confrontational way, where you try to talk not about is it true or false, but what does it mean for me. I mean, that doesn't mean that the issue is solved. I think there's still room also for a doctrinal discussion and an attempt at justification of what one believes and so forth. But if there is a unique contribution to make, I think that sort of more experiential emphasis that women may bring to the dialogue table is something that is important to consider, I think, also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree completely. And actually, we are almost like out of time, but I want to ask you to finish your last words. That I had to cut you off to have time for the questions of the audience, but please finish what you were about to say in the last part.
No, I mean, I was just wrapping up. In fact, I didn't have anything, any big concluding statement to make, other than the idea that it is indeed sort of important to include women in any form of dialogue. So not just women dialoguing with other women. That, I think, has been a very important part of interreligious dialogue, where women felt that they had a safe space to dialogue among each other about topics that were important for them. And that was and continues to be, I think, something that's important in interreligious dialogue. But what I think should not happen is that that's the only type of contribution that women can make to the dialogue. I think what is important is to bring indeed women to any dialogue table, whether it's among the theologians or the legal scholars or the highest representatives of different religious traditions. There has to be sort of a voice for women, I think, at the dialogue table. But not only for women themselves, but for the enrichment of their respective traditions.
Mm-hmm. I think what you said about the feminism and women's involvement in dialogue does also have this question like of representation, because in many cases, women who are carrying out these feminist movements are denied the legitimacy of representing those established or official religious traditions. Mm-hmm. So no matter what, their participation in dialogue is always in this unofficial ways, or that this is your opinion, this is your interpretation, you don't speak on behalf of all these people kind of approach. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that? Like, how can women be more involved in dialogue, but also gather or attain more authority, mm-hmm. In these respective religious traditions, so that they can actually contribute positively?
Mm-hmm. I think that is already happening. I mean, it has to happen a lot more than it is right now. But the very fact that you are a feminist scholar at a university and your own tradition, I think we sometimes forget how recent all of this is. The very fact that women have a voice in their theological traditions, or know their traditions enough to contribute in this critical and constructive way, is maybe something of the past 30, at most 40 years. So we've already made, I think, big strides, and we have to sometimes just sort of make sure that our voices are heard and not be shy about it ourselves. And little by little, I think the traditions will become more receptive and more open. There's so many changes that have happened in the past 50 years. And I think, women's voices are heard more. There's a long way to go still, but I think the door is opened, and there is a sort of a crack in the tradition through which we can sort of shine our light, so to speak.
Yeah, I think it's now time to focus on what we say. Like for a while, the struggle was to be able to speak, no, regardless of what you were saying. I think that was itself was a struggle. Now we get to the stage where we critically think about what we say and what we speak, and how can we contribute to the world of dialogue, interreligious dialogue. As as people who are committed to different religious traditions.
Mhm.
So
I think if you just look at the article by Aisha Hidayatullah, so she's already the next generation of feminist scholar within Islam who has the freedom to even critique the sort of mothers of Islamic feminism. So there's so much happening that's very exciting and forward looking, that I'm definitely optimistic looking at the future.
yeah, thank you so much. For I think we are just on time, 7:16. So we can finish now. But this was a great talk, and I kind of learned a lot. I hope, like in this Women's History Month, like this will be more a chance of exploring how women can be more active and part of interreligious dialogue, the world of interreligious dialogue. Not just people that are spoken about, but actually people who are doing this dialogue themselves, and in official and unofficial settings. That is our wish, to see women around the table, without essentializing them, without putting them in certain boxes, like be more emotional, be more effective kind of thinking. So it's our hope that these kinds of events and these kinds of organizations will contribute to that process and to that progress. So thank you very much for your talk, and thank you very much for everyone who has listened to us this evening.